So I'm guessing probably Krystal doesn't need a lot of introduction because Elaine wrote something about Krystal in her From Our Pastor column at The Navigator. I've known Krystal since maybe 2014. We actually met on a hiking trail.
Yeah.
We met on the Pine Cobble Trail just in back of my house. And so Krystal, we have a connection because Krystal graduated from Williams College and we used to live in Williamstown. So we met on the trail, and you probably read through the various material that Elaine had, that she also has hiked the Appalachian Trail. So she is a person with a lot of fortitude, a lot of strength, and also a lot of warmth. And I think we're very privileged to have her here to have a conversation with us on some difficult topics, as these are these days. So I will hand it over to Krystal.
Thank you, Barbara.
Has anyone else hiked the Appalachian Trail besides Connie, who hiked the Appalachian Trail? Two people in the congregation at the same time.
Connie,
nice.
Yeah, fabulous. You can compare trail names afterwards.
Yeah.
Krystal, thank
Oh,
you.
thank you so much. It is truly a pleasure to be here today, and I do want to apologize for my lack of a formal attire, or more, kind of church appropriate. My grandfather was a Baptist minister and served a church in Virginia for over 40 years. So I grew up in the church, and it has really shaped my perspective in life. For a very long time, I considered myself, and I still do, but with some additional nuance, as a Christian first, a Black person second, and a female. So if you had to ask me how I, identify with different demographics, that was how for a very long time I have been thinking about myself. So it has been the past 2 years in particular have been incredibly difficult as I try to reconcile all of my different identities with the way the world reacts to them. Well, I would say longer than 2 years, really, since Trump was elected. And I'm not intending to get political, but I think we can agree that the way key members of the church politic in the U.S. came out and excused some behavior, really took a broad view of scripture that I'm not sure is textually supported. I think that's the best way I can say it. Really made me very concerned about what it meant to be Christian in these days. And so I thought I would just offer some reflections really drawn from the past year, because I've also been on a journey of appreciating the underlying structural nature of racism in the US and how that has shaped so much. So in some ways, just as many of you are learning about white privilege, I'm also learning about what that means as well. And the other side of the coin, which is the lack of privilege for people of color, specifically Black people, because I think that within the US history, there is a particular animus, is kind of how I like to describe it, towards Black people. And I think that came out of the narrative around justifying slavery, because there had to be some type of narrative to justify the abject dehumanization of a people. And so that narrative still continues, but coded in different ways throughout our cultural underpinnings. So I would, as I do with so many things, like to ground it in scripture. And this is not a sermon 2.0, but for me, because of how I've made sense of the world for so long, is through scripture. A lot of my processing through the events since George Floyd's murder, I really relied on my faith and really relied on scriptural references to help me grow beyond the utter anger I had for all white people, regardless of how dear they were to me. It was just as a group, I was just very angry. And I know that there are still quite a few of my, Black friends and colleagues who have held on to their anger. And so I just like to pull back the cover and share with you my thought process, and hopefully that will open up a conversation and a dialogue amongst us. And maybe from that, there can be a couple of points that we can all take, leaving out of here today to go forth into the world. So the first question that I think of is, why does racism even exist? And I think, like with so many other isms, it is about power. And I think, when we think about the personal power that each one of us desires to have some sense of agency in the world, even underneath the quest for power is really a desire for significance, to know that we matter, that we have value. And we see that struggle, or we see that quest for significance, as early as Cain and Abel in the Bible. We see it in the disciples when they asked Jesus, who's the greatest in the kingdom? And we see it today in how scriptures are used to create those who are, the haves and the have-nots spiritually. So it is, I think, part of the psychology of man when we do not seek our significance in God. It is a part of the psychology of man to seek significance in comparison to other people groups or to other people. So it is part of the human condition. And for me, as a Black woman, I do sometimes become very much like David and plaintively cry out, like, why me, God? Like, why is this trouble befalling me? Why am I experiencing this? And, I have started to take solace in the words of Jesus when he says, in this world you will have trouble. So not to be surprised when it comes, in whatever form it comes. And when George Floyd died, when George Floyd was murdered in 2020, it kicked off a series of conversations among my friends, also in the legal community here in Maine, that really woke me up. It was almost like a glass of ice water was thrown onto my face. Because for me, I grew up, as I said, my grandfather was a Baptist minister. My father was a police officer turned entrepreneur. And so in a lot of ways, I was very much raised in the straight and narrow path. And I continued my commitment to that path as an adult, going to school, getting a good education, seeking good jobs, seeking a lot of external validation. And so thankfully, probably about 10 years ago, God started bringing really monumental challenges in my life because, quite frankly, I'd become a little self-righteous. Well, not a little, I'd become a lot self-righteous. And God was just continued to bring challenges into my life that I could not reason my way out of, that I couldn't be good enough to get out of. And through that process of breaking, I really got to a point where I could better appreciate the perspective and the frustration of people who perhaps didn't make the same choices I made in life, but were still suffering the consequences of being a Black person in America in a system that was not constructed to see us succeed. And so it took me from my pedestal of I've been doing all of the right things to, wow, it doesn't matter how correct I am or how much I buy into this system, this broader economic system and social system in which I was born. I will never fit into this system because it wasn't designed for me. And so to make this more specific, after I finished, so I used to work at a Fortune 100 company. Before my law degree, I had a business degree from an Ivy League institution, and went from there into this company where I was told that I was a high risk, high reward hire. I was the first black person, but I also happened to be a black female that was hired into this accelerated leadership program. So they often use me as an internal consultant, helping out on particularly thorny problems where there was a lot of disagreement or personality conflicts at the executive level, at the C-suite of the company. So I was the fixer. And, after maybe about 8 years, I got burned out. So I took a year off. That's when I hiked the trail. When I went back to this company, I was reporting to a corporate senior vice president who told me, like just flat out, I was sitting across the desk from him, told me that as a black woman, I had to be mindful of what was actually, how much I could actually achieve in this company. And mind you, I was not asking to be named director of a division. I was actually asking to be demoted to a factory position so I could gain operational experience, which is something I didn't have on my resume in this company. And so at the time, I was still very much in this mindset of, we're all God's children, we're all equal, like he's really trying to help me out. And, so this as, I think in part because of my upbringing, but also by being a black woman in the world, my default is to think, oh, I'm wrong. It's not the system, it's not the person telling me something that dehumanizes me. It's something inherent to who I am that is flawed and not worthy. So this is part of what has been inherited through slavery. And, it wasn't until after I had followed this senior leader's lead and taken a position that was even more introductory than the one that I had requested. So the position that I ended up going into, it was the only job qualification is that you have a high school degree. Now it was a complex job. I'm not going to deny that for people for whom that was an aspiration to have that job. I'm not trying to deny the skills necessary for that job, but just to say that I was a math and psychology major from Williams College. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was a returned Peace Corps volunteer. I had my MBA. I worked in the company for almost a decade at that point, and this is what the company thought that was most appropriate for me to do. And once I got into that position, I realized never in a million years would they ask a white male at no point to do that. And so that was, for me, a real key turning point. And I promise I will weave all of this together, but I wanted to make that experience concrete because there is nothing like sitting across from an executive who you thought was a mentor, who you thought was thinking not only about your interests, but the long-term interests of the company and the company's stated commitment to diversity, to have them tell you that as a black woman, that's actually not possible for you. It's possible for everyone but you. That does something to you on the inside. There is a sense of shame that is ascribed, that I felt that was solely by factors that I could not change even if I wanted to. And to have that occur just alters something inside of you. Ultimately, I left the company, no surprise there. But it really made me question, like, what was my purpose? Like, how do I think about myself in the world? And if my Christian ideals are not bearing fruit and are not coming to fruition in how my life is unfolding, like, how do I make sense of this God that I serve when all of this seems so confusing? And, Spoiler alert, I don't have the answer to that. I live in the tension daily. This is something I walk out. But it oriented me to this sense of, if I do it changed my orientation fundamentally. So before this experience, about 10 years ago, my thought was, if I did all of the right things, good things will happen. And I am sure that from what I have heard from even my white female friends and colleagues, this is something that for anyone who is not a white male, there was, at some point in your life, you had this thought that if you just did the right things, you would the system would work for you. And that's just fundamentally not true, or it hasn't been true in my experience. And so it turned my orientation to be a little bit more gritty, to begin to expect trouble, and to not just look at what was positive about a situation, but rather whether or not the fundamental ethos and system in which I was existing was going to support my success. And not just support it, but actually advocate and push me towards success. And so, so of course I became a lawyer, because that was the natural next step. But in fact, that is what I did, because I had actually been in conversation with the general counsel of the company for them to pay for me to go to law school and begin, my career as a lawyer with the company. So that was the trajectory I was on before all of this happened. So ultimately, I decided to leave the company, and in true Clampett fashion, for any of you who used to read or watch the Beverly Hills Hillbillies, I packed up my bags and I moved to Maine, because Maine was the place where I felt really comfortable. I don't know if it was because I went through the Western Maine woods in late September, early October, as I was finishing my through hike, but there was just something about the state of Maine that just viscerally called to me. And so, I moved here to restart my life. And after law school, I worked at a law firm called Pierce Atwood for a couple of years, and through a series of experiences there that interestingly parallel the experiences that I had at this Fortune 100 company, I realized that the environment was too conservative, that even though individually, I was able to get along really well with many of the lawyers who were my colleagues and advisors, as a collective, the environment was not one that was supportive of me. So I moved to another law firm in Portland that's considered a scrappier, more socially progressive firm. And it was around that time that the pandemic hit and that George Floyd was murdered. And it was interesting, because being in an environment where I felt that the company was more socially progressive and that they actually took actions to demonstrate that, I was able to better assess whether or not I really wanted to participate in a system, or any organization that I did not have a hand in starting. And it was a really interesting period, because after George Floyd was murdered, we had, and I think I can use that term, it's legally correct, but also the intention of the act was to kill a Black man, to exert power over him. And I'm glad that there was some modicum of legal justice in the verdict that came down. But it started a series of conversations, and I distributed, or I sent Barbara my open letter, which I believe that she sent out to all of you, her fellow congregants. But a young white woman who I actually went to law school with, we had overlapping years, she made some comments about how racism actually wasn't an issue in Maine, that actually sexism was really, really the issue that needed to be focused on. And then her argument went off the rails a little bit, because she started talking about pedophiles in schools and all this other sort of stuff. It was very bizarre. But for me, what I found really intriguing was that even though people came out against her and said, hey, your comments are wrong, they're racist, you're missing the point, no one really took on her argument. No one really approached what she was saying and said, I'm just going to take what you say at face value and respond to that. So I was just kind of watching from the wings, like watching all of this unfold on LinkedIn, because, you know, nothing says moral outrage like a bunch of social media posts going back and forth. And then I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but every once in a while, you know, I feel like this is what I call like the God moving in me. I just feel like something welling up, and it becomes increasingly more difficult not to act. And so this is what happened to me as I was seeing all of this frenzy go back and forth. I just had this force well up in me. And it was interesting because part of it was because of what she was saying, some of the factual, historical inaccuracies in what she was saying. Part of it was just as a Black woman, I was like, you are proving the point of white privilege by how you are articulating your argument and coming out at this point in time. And then the other part of me was very much part of my Christian identity, because she and her husband are relatively new converts and were making assertions about Jesus that, again, lacked textual support. And so I decided to respond. And it was really important to me because I knew a little bit of her story. You know, she, like me, grew up in very humble circumstances. So I grew up in a Habitat for Humanity community in North Carolina. I don't know all the specifics of her story, but I know she struggled, and I know she had some really tough circumstances. And this isn't about, I have learned that when it comes to issues of race, or really any issue that implicates someone's decency as a person, it's never helpful to go into attack mode. And for me personally, I'm always trying to find common ground. I'm willing to admit when there is no common ground, but I always start first from trying to find common ground. And so I really approached, I tried to respond to her from a place of empathy, while also balancing that empathy with more accurate historical information that is relevant not only nationally, but to the state of Maine. So pointing out that, for instance, the KKK was very active in Maine in the early part of the 1900s, had a very large presence in Maine, and often used the same type of rhetoric of strong family values that she was now espousing. And there's nothing wrong with strong family values. It's only when you put strong family values in kind of casting aside a group of people, right? So, you know, from my response, I unexpectedly had this platform from which I could talk about issues of importance. And it was interesting and very unsettling because I'm the type of person who likes to fly under the radar. And so I was very reluctant to step onto this platform that was suddenly created with all of the expectations that went along with it. But what it did do for me was really put me in a place where I could start to think more strategically about my life. And I say this to everyone with whom I speak about these issues, is up until June of 2020, my perspective and my approach to life and issues of racism was to try to bring together multicultural coalitions and to find ways to assimilate into the system. And so my perspective has always been, look, I'm not going to debate you about the value of Black people. I'm just going to show up and do my work, and showed you through my actions that we as Black people are like equally capable, equally smart, you know, equally human. Because that sometimes, like, that just seems to be like a fundamental missing piece, that I am a human being. So yes, as a Black woman, there are specifics of my experience that have been shaped by a society that does not want to see me succeed. But as a human being we have far more in common than we have differences. And so getting to the point after George Floyd's murder, where I recognized and accepted that there were some people who just were not going to acknowledge and affirm my humanity, it gave me more of a desire to do that not only for myself, but for others. So I had to become my biggest advocate. This was, again, another perspective shift for me, because up until then, so I moved from, if I'm just good, the system will take care of me, to, okay, I need to question the system I'm in, to, I need to advocate for myself really assertively, and if that means leaving a system, that's okay. And so the second welling of action that happened was within this law firm that I had just joined. I was there for about 10 months before I decided, these are great people. This is a culture where I could actually see myself. But the underlying structure, like if I'm trying to advocate for myself within this system, I don't see myself getting very far. So that is what led me to leave that firm altogether and start something of my own. So in November of last year, I actually started 2 organizations. I started my law firm, and I call it an advisory firm, both legal and business services, called Providentia Group, named for the Roman goddess of foresight and wisdom. And then I started the Alpha Legal Foundation, which recognizes that lawyers in particular, and those in the legal profession, so also judges, we have over history played a very particular role in ensuring that racist ideology is embedded in our laws, in our court decisions, in how we as a society and culture operate. And so I believe that it is now incumbent on those in the legal profession to, again, take a leadership role to help dismantle and change that system. And part of the way that I believe that needs to happen is by actually having more brown and black people as attorneys. So the Alpha Legal Foundation is really intended to create a broader and deeper pipeline for diverse attorneys, and also engage those who are currently in legal leadership positions to talk about these issues, because the law is one of the oldest professions, and it is also one of the most conservative. And so really, in order for strides to be taken there, bold, consistent action needs to happen. Now, I have no idea what that's going to look like here in Maine, where there is not currently a huge diverse population, but we are seeing a greater diversity of people coming to Maine. And I want to make sure that even those who are interested in pursuing law know that there are others who look like them who are out here in the profession. A week ago on Monday, I had a conversation with a 4th grader. She is amazing. When I talked to her, I was like, the world is going to be all right with people like her in it. Just really wise beyond her years. But her counselor reached out to me because she has a friend. So this 4th grader, we'll call her Amelia. Amelia has a friend called Pam. And Pam's grandfather doesn't like people who look like Amelia. And Amelia is just a lovely shade of brown. And so Pam, her friend, is in the foster care system and has to spend most of her time with her grandfather. Now, Amelia just wants to play with her friend, but she's scared to go and spend time with her friend when her friend is staying with her grandfather. And so Amelia wanted to talk to me about how she could help her friend, how she could make time to play with her friend and while she protects herself, and she wanted to know what it took to be a lawyer. And so she came to me with her list of questions, and we had a great conversation. But when I think about the conversation that I had with Amelia, I was like, this is why the Alpha Legal Foundation exists. to be able to show up for people like Amelia so she doesn't think that she's out there by herself, so that she sees that there is an example of someone who looks like her, who is doing the work that she's interested in doing, who can be both an inspiration and a practical source of support for her. So, I mentioned that, after George Floyd's murder, I was really angry. And I would say like August and September of last year were probably my toughest months, because I have, as someone who has spent the majority of my adult life in predominantly white environments, it is no surprise that the majority of my friends are white Americans. And a lot of my friends, no surprise, are also very progressive. And so it was really difficult for me to find ways to articulate the anger that I was feeling, the frustration, I think ultimately the hurt that I felt by being sold this faulty bill of goods about what it took to be successful in the world, and what it meant for me as a Black woman, how I needed to move about the world to be successful. And what really I can now understand how there are some factions of the Black population who are just like, I don't want to deal with the white population, I just want to deal with other Black and brown people. I now better understand where that mentality comes from. And I was very close to being kind of mired in there. But what really struck me, and this is where I just, give like shout out to the Holy Spirit. Whoop, whoop. Every once in a while, like different scriptures will come to my mind. And at that time, what really came to my mind were two things. One is the scripture, who the Son sets free will be free indeed. And so that for me was an anchor in, God has created the world. Yes, sin is present in the world, but Jesus has overcome that. So there is a path forward, there is hope. And there is a very practical example in the scriptures of that. When Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery. And I feel that where we are now as a society, it's, yes, the physical strictures of slavery have been done away with, but the mental and cultural strictures are still in place. And I feel like that is the exodus that we are experiencing now collectively. And so that also gives me hope. And then just to kind of wrap up, because I feel like I've been talking at you for a while now, the final piece, oh, yes. Oh, yay. No, this is awesome. Just in time for me to be quiet. But the other piece, and for me, what I consider the promised land, and why I believe that particularly as the church, with the teachings that we have, with the hope that we have, I feel like the church, and that's the church with a capital C, like has such an important role to play right now in where we are, is because we are ministers of reconciliation. And we do have the hope of the gospel. And, in the scriptures, it specifically talks about the dividing wall being torn away. So there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, Black or white. And so that is really the hope that I carry forth with me, that gives me the capacity to respond to ignorance and to those who search for significance by trying to put me down. And I am very grateful for the opportunity to have worshiped with you all this morning, because all of the fundamental focus on love and the ministry of reconciliation is what I think is so necessary as we continue this spiritual exodus out of the U.S. and specifically the U.S.'s history that's been mired in slavery. So thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts with you. And I'm happy to take any questions, or if we just want to have an open dialogue, that's fine too. Yes?
I appreciate
Excuse me, just,
comments.
Seth, before you start, again, we all want to hear Krystal's answers, but we have to hear the question too. So when you ask your question, please focus on the mic and speak loudly. Thank you.
I don't really care, George. I appreciate your talk, and it strikes me so interestingly because everyone knows, especially from the South, if you're from the Southeast, as we grew up, that the most segregated hour of the week is 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. And it's a very interesting problem, but have you heard of, I mean, not to address that now, but have you heard of Brian Stevenson's initiative with the Equal Justice Institute to document the sort of vigilante killings of Black people in America? Okay.
Yeah.
I've had trouble reaching out to him because I feel I was a witness to such, and it's been very disappointing to me. And so I sympathize with your story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very strange when you have kind of grown up in such an area that's torn by segregation laws. I guess we call them laws, but really I feel sometimes that what we're struggling with are more or less social constructs. They're constructions that are very social. Yeah. Laws become laws because they're societal preferences. Yeah. And sometimes it seems a very dehumanizing place. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to just address a couple of things that you've said there. So absolutely, race in and of itself is a social construct. It is something that was part of the narrative to justify slavery. If you go back, before there was a colony in Virginia, or right at the time that the Virginia colony was started, first of all, it was a business. So we have to understand and appreciate the economic underpinnings of what eventually became a race-based labor and economic caste system. But up until that point, people were really categorized by the country or geography in the world from which they came. It was really only, there is no easier way to distinguish people than what you see visibly. And one of the first judicial opinions on the books was in I'm going to get the exact year wrong, but around 1620 to 1640. It was the John Punch decision. And it was where three indentured servants ran away. There was a Scotsman, maybe a Dutch, and then an African. And when they were caught and brought back, the African was given a lifetime of indentured servitude. That's in effect slavery. The other two, who were white or from European countries, were given, I think their indentured servitude was extended by a modest number of years. So that was the first documented decision of two things. One, slavery, and then two, a difference in judicial opinion for the same behavior based on race. And so to say that lawyers and judges, this is why I created the Alpha Legal Foundation, because there is clear documentation that highlights and emphasizes the role that lawyers and judges had in codifying slavery. And it's absolutely horrific, particularly for a profession that prides itself in fairness and justice. And the other piece that I'd like to offer for your consideration in humility and love is I am not sure how you're reaching out to Brian Stevenson. As someone who is a noted speaker and author, I would imagine that the demands on his time are great. And part of privilege is assuming that when you reach out, someone has to respond.
Well, it's very frustrating. And I appreciate your presence here so much. We don't live around many African Americans down east, and I came here summer, and as a child, my earliest memories are from down east Maine. But what has spoken to me through the experience, which I actually, in a way, as a brother of a different color, associate kind of with a lot of what you said about the sense of looking lower being off limits if you want to go higher, which was an astounding articulation of what I think is that racism is also that. Racism is about only looking higher, and I think it's unchristlike to say that those lower beneath are the problem, in the sense that slavery started with this lowest sort of level. You should be looking higher. You should be that all, in a sense, all efforts, all achievement is a certain kind of pay grade or a kind of a level of achievement which gives you authority over the lower. I'm a musician myself, so none of that makes sense, actually. It's not the way you make good music.
Right.
You can't really have a palatial sort of Aeolian kind of heaven in music. It's boring in a sense. It's a kind of a cliche, but that really resonated with me because I actually feel that sometimes the sins of the past are so great that even in the sort of realm of Brian Stevenson, they may even have trouble understanding them or recognizing them. And I feel I grew up in such a place. I grew up in such a place, as you mentioned, where black people segregate from white people because they are uncomfortable about the past. And it's very heartbreaking. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
What is your vision of your foundation? What is the vision? What is your
What
specifically are you?
What is the vision of the Alpha Legal Foundation specifically?
And in specifics.
Yeah. So the specific vision, as I can currently articulate it, is within the next 15 to 20 years, I want a person of color sitting on the law court in the state of Maine. Maine is one of, I think, about 20 states, don't hold me to that number, subject to check, that has never had a person of color sitting on its highest court in the state. And so I'd like to, understanding that these things take time and that there are specific qualifications that are looked for, within 15 to 20 years to have such a person on Maine's law court. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm troubled by the words that we use to describe people. I'm troubled that we have to describe human beings as male or female, white or black, gay or straight.
Yep.
Any of the various things, Asian, South American, and I really think, for me anyway, the way to go about this is not talk about the differences, but talk about the similarities, which we're all human beings, and we're all created equal in God's sight. And I think that the media and the pundits and the social media just sort of reinforce this business of separation because, we talk about Amelia Harris being the first woman vice president, the first person of color being vice president. All this stuff just continues to separate us. And if we just stop trying to describe people in those terms, we can better off. So I have a question. The question is, how do you prefer to be known? I mean, you said you think of yourself as a Christian, as a black person, and as a woman. But why can't we just say we're human beings and not have to have all these distinctions? Or is it important to you that we say to you, yes, you're a person of color, and we celebrate that? I mean, will you sort of respond to that question?
Yeah, I think that is a really a great question, and I'm going to attempt to paraphrase it and tell me if I get this right or wrong for purpose of posterity in the mic here. So how do I particularly like to be called? And then the broader question is, why can't we move beyond, the different demographic labels that are used to, that can actually further separate us, or is there value to keeping them? And I think that my answer is probably going to be wholly unsatisfactory, because I'm going to say yes. No. So I think this is a two-part answer, which is, I think that it is important to recognize that demographic profiles move through the world differently, and that underneath that, we are all human and have very many of the same values and basic needs. And part of why I think that's important, and I hope that I am not going to be too on the nose here, but as a community of older people, there are certain limitations that you may have, certain needs that you may have, by virtue of how many years you've walked the earth and the effects of time on the body. It is respectful and appropriate to recognize and honor your time, your experience, and to provide accommodations to support you showing up in a way that is comfortable for you. Would you say that's a fair statement? Take that same philosophy and apply it to other demographics, whether it be race-based, gender-based, or sexual preference or orientation. So that is why it's important, I believe, to still see, and if the person with whom you're interacting is comfortable with you naming their demographic and centering that specifically. And I will be the first to say that's a case-by-case situation. So it's in conversation with someone from a different community saying, I see you. Now, how much of what I see do you want me to kind of infuse in how we're interacting? Because I can tell you, I do not speak for all Black people. I do not speak for all Black Mainers. I speak for Krystal Williams. And for me, I appreciate the acknowledgement that as a Black woman, my experience may not be the same as yours. But I don't want you to dwell on it. I much prefer to move beyond to where we're similar. That is my personal bent. There are other people who have very different preferences. And so I do believe that it is important, broadly speaking, to recognize that different demographics have different experiences, and to, in conversation with either the person or community, explore how they want support for their experience. I really, thinking back to where I was a year ago, I really appreciate that my friends, my white friends, allowed me to be angry. They just allowed me to say things that I would typically never say, which is like, all white people, oh my gosh. That's not typically how I talk, but I needed to get that out because that's how I was experiencing the world at the time. And my friends gave me grace and space to have that expression.
That's really important. Thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully I answered your question in a somewhat satisfactory way.
I'm going to tell you a very quick story.
Yeah.
I was in the military in the late 60s. I served in Frankfurt, Germany. And, I grew up as a child in the John Foster Dulles era where, Soviets were not human, where they had horns or something. It was just crazy stuff. And I had to go to Berlin. And because my service period I couldn't fly in, I had to go on a duty train. And we took the duty train from Frankfurt to Potsdam. And early at 5 o'clock in the morning, of course, the sun was out, this was in August, there was Soviet military patrolling the platform. And we were all standing on the side of there was a walkway in the train all sides, and someone said, oh, those are human beings, they don't have horns and whatnot. And I thought to myself, oh my God, he's right.
Yeah.
And so we get sort of stereotyped
Yeah.
by our experience and by what we have. And so sometimes it takes just a lot of, well, sometimes gentle nudging, sometimes it takes a sledgehammer
Yeah.
to try and change those things. But I mean, it's just too bad that we can't get beyond this stuff
Yeah.
because it's so debilitating for
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, no, I agree. And hopefully there will be a point in the future where we can get beyond it. And I believe that where we are right now, context is specific. So specifically with the example of Kamala Harris, right? I don't know if you saw the image that came out shortly after she was elected, but it showed just row after row after row of white male faces, and then it showed her face at the end. Right? And so when we think about the journey from segregation to inclusion, you know, one of the first steps is diversity, which is really just having more black and brown bodies around the table. And once those bodies come around the table, if the narrative changes from white men in power to, oh, people in power, you've now diminished the accomplishment of having a Black, Asian Pacific woman in power. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to continue to name until there are more brown and other type of faces peppering that sea of who's allowed to be in power and what people in power look like. So I really think that it's important to continue to name now, in part because it does give inspiration to other people coming up. It does point to and explicitly call out that it's not just white men who are able to lead the country and who are able to lead companies. And so as we see more people of color and different sexual orientations in power, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the current administration, just how it really reflects the panoply of kind of the United States, then I think we can move away from labeling people because it will be understood and accepted that anyone can lead and hold power effectively. I don't think we're quite there yet, though.
Long ways to go.
Yeah.
I hate to do this, but there's so many of the motifs that you have mentioned today that are, by the way, part of Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, which is one of the Advent books we may be studying. If you'd like to hear them in a different framework, the same things that you have said are just incredible. So you have an opportunity to hear it again.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I want to be mindful that this is your Sunday afternoon and I've already taken up a lot of your time, but I just really appreciate the opportunity to worship with you and talk. Thank you.